It was raining the morning I met Ethan Blackwell, and I remember thinking that the weather was trying to warn me. The kind of cold that seeps through your coat and finds your bones. The kind of sky that looks like a bruise pressed against the horizon. I had just moved to Westfield for a fresh start. A new job at Crestwood Publishing, a small apartment on Maple Lane, and absolutely zero intention of falling in love with anyone, let alone the man who would spend the first 3 months of knowing me making my life quietly miserable. He was standing by the reception desk when I walked in, soaking wet from the rain, my portfolio tucked under one arm and my confidence hanging by a thread. He had dark hair, sharp jaw, and the kind of posture that said he owned the room without trying. He glanced at me once, just once, and looked away, break time .05s, as if I wasn't worth a second look. I told myself it didn't sting. I lied to myself quite often back then. My name is Avery Quinn, and at 24 years old, I had survived a broken engagement, a cross-country move, and 2 years of barely scraping by. I was not fragile, I was not naive, but I was not prepared for Ethan Blackwell, and no amount of survival experience could have taught me how to handle a man who looked at me like I was a problem he hadn't decided whether to solve or ignore. The first official thing he said to me was, "You're late." I wasn't. My watch said 8:58 a.m. The position had specified 9 o'clock, and I was standing in front of him with 2 minutes to spare. But he was the senior editor, and I was the new editorial assistant, and apparently in his world, being on time meant being early. Break time 0.05s, and being early was the only acceptable standard. I learned that very quickly. I learned a lot of things very quickly when it came to Ethan. He handed me a manuscript, 340 pages, double-spaced, coffee-stained on the corner, and told me he needed a complete developmental review by Thursday. It was Monday. I didn't blink. I took the manuscript, found my desk in the corner of the open plan office, and I got to work. I told myself I would not let him see me struggle. I would not give him the satisfaction. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that Ethan Blackwell had his own reasons for keeping people at a distance, his own history that made walls feel safer than windows, his own scars that had never quite healed. Break time 05s. And somewhere between the coffee-stained manuscript and the 100 quiet mornings that followed, those walls were going to start coming down, whether either of us wanted them to or not. By the second week, I had mapped the geography of Ethan's moods the way a sailor maps dangerous waters. There was the Tuesday morning version of him, quieter, more focused, less likely to find fault with your work. There was the post-lunch version, more impatient, the kind of man who sighed at commas placed incorrectly and returned manuscripts with margin notes, written in red ink so sharp they felt personal. And there was the late evening version, when most of the office had gone home and it was just the two of us under the fluorescent lights. And something about him seemed to soften at the edges, just slightly. Break time .05s. The way a hard candy starts to dissolve the longer you keep it in your mouth. I never mentioned the evening version. I was afraid if I acknowledged it, it would disappear. He corrected my work often in those early weeks. Not cruelly. He was never what I would call cruel, exactly. But precisely in that way that feels worse than cruelty because it carries no heat, only indifference. He would leave notes on my desk, not emails, notes, handwritten on small white cards, his script clean and angular. Page 12, the passive voice weakens the argument. Revise. Or, your summary of chapter 3 misses the thematic point entirely. Read again. And once, just once, in the third week, this paragraph is good. That was all. 4 words. I kept that one. I put it in the front pocket of my bag, and I didn't examine why. Break time .05s. My coworkers warned me about him. Maya, who sat at the desk nearest mine and had been at Crestwood for 3 years, leaned over one afternoon and told me in a low voice that Ethan had made 2 editorial assistants quit in the past year alone. Not because he was abusive, she was careful to say, but because he had this way of making you feel like you weren't quite enough, no matter how hard you worked. "He's brilliant," she said, "and he knows it, and the problem is he's usually right." She paused. "But he's also lonely in a way that makes him mean sometimes. Don't take it personally." I took it very personally. I always did. That was my problem and my gift in equal measure. I felt everything a little too completely, processed it a little too deeply. Break time, 0.05s. My ex-fiance used to say, I wore my heart on my sleeve and made everyone around me responsible for the weather. Maybe he was right. Maybe that was why, when Ethan was dismissive, I went home and sat by my window and felt it like something physical, a weight in my chest that had no name. But I didn't quit. That was the thing about me. I had been underestimated enough times that being underestimated had stopped feeling like defeat and started feeling like fuel. Every cold note he left on my desk became a reason to work harder. Every sigh became a reason to stay later. I was going to be the best editorial assistant Crestwood Publishing had ever seen, and I was going to do it right in front of the man who had decided on day one that I wasn't worth a second look. What I didn't count on was that, somewhere along the way, he started looking. Break time, 0.05s. It was a Friday in November when the building's heating system decided to fail entirely. The temperature outside had dropped to 30 degrees, and the old Victorian office building, which Crestwood rented at a price that was apparently far more sentiment than sense, offered almost no insulation against a serious cold snap. By 4 in the afternoon, most of the staff had packed up and gone home. By 5, it was just me and Ethan, because I had a manuscript due Monday and he had, apparently, nowhere else to be. We didn't speak for the first hour. He worked at his desk. I worked at mine. The building was very quiet, except for the sound of the wind pressing against the old windows and the occasional creak of the radiators that were trying and failing to produce heat. Break time, 0.05s. I had wrapped my scarf around my shoulders and was pretending very hard not to be cold when I heard the sound of footsteps and looked up to find him standing at my desk, holding a cup of tea. He set it down without a word. He didn't look at me. He just set it down and turned to go back to his desk, and I stared at that cup of tea for a full 10 seconds before I found my voice. "Thank you," I said. He paused, didn't turn around. "There's a kettle in the break room," he said. "You should know that." And then he sat back down. It wasn't a kind thing, exactly. It was barely a thing at all. But he had made me tea, and the tea was perfect, strong with exactly the right amount of milk, and no one had told him how I took my tea, which meant he had noticed. At some point, without making a production of it, break time equals 0.05s. Ethan Blackwell had noticed how I took my tea. I drank every last drop and said nothing about it. 20 minutes later, the power went out completely. The emergency lighting came on, dim and greenish and deeply unflattering, and I heard him make a sound I had never heard from him before. Something low and quiet and almost amused. "Well," he said, from across the dark office, "I suppose we're staying a while." And we did. We stayed for 3 more hours, waiting for the building manager, unable to leave because he had a set of manuscripts that needed to be locked in the safe and couldn't be carried out in the dark through the icy parking lot. We sat across from each other in the emergency light, and we talked, not about work. He asked me, out of apparent genuine curiosity, how I had ended up in Westfield. Break time, 0.05s. I told him about the broken engagement in a way that was mostly honest and only slightly edited. He listened without flinching, without offering sympathy I hadn't asked for, without making the kind of awkward noises people make when they don't know what to say to someone else's heartbreak. Then, very quietly, he told me that he knew what it felt like to build a future with someone and watch it dissolve. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. We sat in the dark and held our separate silences, and somehow that was enough to change something. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. December arrived, and something had shifted. It was subtle at first, the way a change in temperature is subtle, felt in the skin before it is understood in the mind. He still left notes on my desk, but the tone had changed, barely perceptibly. Break time equals 05s, in the direction of something that was less correction and more conversation. This section shows real instinct, one said. And then, a week later, your read on the protagonist arc is the most accurate thing I've seen from this office in months. Don't tell Maya I said that. I laughed out loud at my desk, alone, at 9 in the morning. Maya gave me a look from across the room. I didn't explain. He started appearing at my desk around lunchtime. Always with a reason. A question about a manuscript, a note about the editorial schedule, but the reasons grew thinner as the weeks went on. Until one Wednesday he came and sat in the chair beside my desk without any reason at all and said, "How's the Hartley novel coming?" And I told him, and we talked about it for 45 minutes, and I forgot to eat my lunch entirely. Break time equals neuro 5s. I was falling in love with him. I knew it the way you know when the season has genuinely changed. Not when the calendar says so, but when the air itself feels different, and you realize you've been living in the new thing for a while already, just without naming it. I knew it, and I was terrified, because Ethan Blackwell was a man made of stone and silence and small gestures that meant more than they should. And I did not know, could not know, whether any of what I felt was returned, or whether I was once again building a future on ground that was about to give way. It was his sister who told me, over coffee at the little place around the corner from Crestwood, that Ethan had not been in a relationship since his marriage ended 4 years ago. That he had a daughter, Clara, 7 years old and fierce and funny, break time 05s, who lived with his ex-wife in Portland, and who he drove up to see every second weekend without fail. That he had been a different kind of man before the divorce, softer, apparently, more available, and that the man he was now was a version of himself he had built specifically to not get hurt again. "He talks about you," she said, stirring her coffee. "He doesn't know I know, but he does. He said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever hired, and he thought you were going to be a disaster. And then he said," she smiled, "that he was wrong. He said you were the most capable person in his department," which, from Ethan, is practically a love sonnet. I went home that night and sat very still for a long time. And then I decided that I was done being afraid. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in January, break time 0, 05s, when the light was thin and gold through the office windows, and the building was warm again, and everything felt possible in the specific way it feels possible when winter is starting to remember that spring exists. He was in his office. I knocked. He said, "Come in." I came in and closed the door behind me. He looked up. He saw my face. Something in him went very still. "Avery," he said, and that was all he said. And the way he said it, careful and low and different from every other way he had ever said my name, told me that he already knew. He had already known for longer than I had, maybe. Or he had known differently, the way a man who has taught himself not to want things still knows what he wants, just from a safer distance. "I'm not good at this," I said. "I know you know that. Break time 0.05s. I think I'm the kind of person who makes the same mistakes for the most genuine possible reasons and then survives them and does it again. And I know that probably sounds like a warning, and maybe it is, but I also think I stopped, took a breath. I think you should know that I think about you all the time. And it's not about work. And I'm telling you because I'd rather know and be wrong than not know at all. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Then he pushed back his chair and stood up and walked around his desk toward me. And his face had done something I had never quite seen it do. Opened somehow, the way a window opens and lets the outside air in. And he said, "I made you tea in November because I didn't know how else to tell you I'd been paying attention." He stopped directly in front of me. Break time equals go fives. Close enough that I could see the specific shade of gray in his eyes that I had cataloged and stored and tried very hard not to think about. I've been paying attention for a long time. Avery. The first time he kissed me was quiet and deliberate. The way everything about him was quiet and deliberate. And it tasted like everything I had been afraid to want. And I understood then what his sister had meant, that the man he was now was a version built for protection, and that I had somehow, without meaning to, found the door in all those walls he'd spent years building, and he had let me. He had, very carefully, left the door unlocked. We didn't solve everything in that office on that Thursday afternoon. Love is not a problem that gets solved in a single scene, but we started. We chose to start. Break time 05s, and sometimes that is the whole story. The moment when two people who have spent so long surviving each other finally decide to stop. That is the beginning of what became the most important relationship of my life. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. Not because Ethan suddenly became simple, he never did, but because it was real, built slowly on a foundation of attention and tea and handwritten notes, and one very cold night in the dark. And real things, in my experience, are always worth the difficulty they cost. He still leaves notes on my desk. They're different now. Last Tuesday, he left one that said only, "Still the most stubborn person I've ever hired. Still exactly right. And I am still keeping every single one. Thank you for listening." If this story found you tonight, I hope it found you gently. There is always a next chapter. Always another morning. And somewhere out there, maybe, someone is already paying attention to you in ways you haven't noticed yet. Good night.